By the end of 2024, many believed we had seen it all. Global politics had reached a state of peak structural chaos. But then came 2025, and with it, Donald Trump. Virtually every major geopolitical development of the past year has borne the unmistakable imprint of Donald John Trump. Successive rounds of trade wars, repeated and failed Russian-Ukrainian peace talks, Iran's humiliation at the hands of Israel, the shaping of a deal in Gaza, pressure on Venezuela, and much more. Trump himself boasts that he has brought an end to 8 wars. Yet while each of these episodes carries significant geopolitical weight on its own, the most consequential shift may lie elsewhere. The unraveling of the so-called ironclad partnership between Europe and the United States. The new US national security strategy, the single most important document guiding American foreign policy, states this openly. In the section devoted to Europe, the Trump administration adopts its most overtly confrontational tone, directly questioning Europe's political legitimacy by pointing to what it describes as anti-democratic processes. The NSS is only one of many signs of friction, if not outright hostility, along the US-Europe axis over the past year. Trump declares that he has enough of Europe's free riding and demands change, while simultaneously expecting a quasi-tribute to Washington. Yet this shift in trajectory and the end of the ironclad partnership may set a precedent that strikes at the very foundations of American hegemony. For decades, the transatlantic relationship was symbiotic, serving both sides. Its breakdown threatens not only Europe, suddenly waking up exposed in a world of predators, but also the very system that underpins American global leadership. How exactly? Let's find out. Questioning another center of power's ideological foundations and democratic legitimacy is, in geopolitics, among the gravest accusations one can level. And this is precisely what the United States has done toward the European Union. In and of itself, regardless of whether Trump is right or wrong, this constitutes an implicit act of hostility. Trade agreements can be debated. Political agendas can clash. But calling into question the very foundations on which the entire European project rests is something else entirely. These are matters over which only the citizens of EU member states have the right to decide and to shape. All the more so given the Trump administration shows little hesitation when it comes to what he describes the civilizational erasure of countries such as the Russian Federation. The national security strategy marked a kind of culmination of Trump's many points of friction with Europe. At the core were disputes over a peace settlement in Ukraine, a trade war waged by Trump that also targeted Europe, and repeated challenges to NATO's cohesion. Taken together, these developments have gradually cast a large question mark over the future of the so-called ironclad partnership between the United States and Europe. True, there is no codified union between Europe and the United States. Different elites govern on both sides of the Atlantic, guided by different interests. And yet, ordinary citizens long perceived these two economic spaces as forming an almost seamless whole, if only at the level of shared values. Whether you were walking the streets of New York or Paris, Seattle or Warsaw, you moved within a single Western cultural sphere. That perception has now been challenged. Trump and the administration around him have concluded that previous liberal American elites, and by extension American society itself, were exploited by Europeans. Why? Because it was the US naval armada that secured the globalized system from which Europe benefited, and which, Trump argues, harmed the United States. Because Europe failed to build armed forces commensurate with its economic weight and instead relied on American military power. Because Europe ran a trade surplus with the United States, because Europe is seen as partially responsible for America's reindustrialization while maintaining a strong industrial base of its own. Some of these charges have merit, in particular the argument that Europe chronically neglected its own security while relying on the United States is difficult to dismiss. This dependency may have even been a factor, if only indirectly, contributing to the outbreak of war in Ukraine. Yet, contrary to Donald Trump's framing, the transatlantic relationship was far more symbiotic than the 47th President of the United States suggests, and crucially, it served both sides. Let's start with the fundamentals. If Europe were truly exploiting the United States, it should be reflected in the data. But the numbers tell a different story. In 2010, Europe's and America's shares of global GDP were remarkably similar. Since then, their trajectories have sharply diverged. Europe's share has fallen significantly, while that of the United States has risen. Nominal GDP per capita was also comparable as recently as 2008. Today, the average American is between 50 and 100% wealthier than the average Western European, a gap that remains visible even after adjusting for purchasing power parity. GDP is hardly a perfect metric, but there is no better aggregate measure of a country's current level of development. The claim that the United States is being exploited is therefore far from clear-cut. It may hold when set against China, whose power has indeed grown substantially within the rules and norms of a world shaped by liberal American elites. But China's rise owes far more to decisions made in Washington and Silicon Valley than to anything that happened in Europe. So by targeting Europe in aiming for something better, Trump's risks losing what already works. For American business, the true foundation of Washington's power, Europe functions as a force multiplier. Undermining that relationship risks weakening not only Europe, but the very system that underwrites American strength. Europe, the great victor of the Industrial Revolution that made the automobile a mass product, semi-consciously chose to sit out the Internet revolution, with only a handful of exceptions. One might ask why. After all, Europe fought and largely won the battle in the automotive sector and across many other industrial domains. That success itself offers part of the explanation. Precisely because Europe was already strong, it was easier to stick with what it knew. There was no sense of urgency, no compulsion to pick up the gauntlet. Europe felt no existential need to enter this new revolution and in effect accepted that it would be almost entirely annexed by the Americans. At first glance, this may seem puzzling. Any serious independent power wants autonomy and its own brands in emerging technologies. And it is worth recalling that in the 1980s and early 1990s, Western Europe's combined GDP was nominally larger than that of the United States. The puzzle dissolves, however, once we note a simple fact. Europeans had no problem with American software because they did not feel threatened by America. It was seen as a single space of shared values and shared purpose. When Facebook wiped out Skyrock in France, or when Messenger displaced StudyVZ in Germany, along with dozens of smaller local firms across Europe, this was widely accepted as the natural course of things. Only when even a faint ideological concern emerges does a need arise through national policy or entrepreneurial mobilization to build an independent domestic sector. In the context of competition with the United States, this impulse was entirely alien to Europe at the time. China, by contrast, never faced such hesitation. There was no debate over whether to build and support domestic platforms, including a closed internet of its own. That's how Baidu, Alipay, WeChat, and others all took the Chinese market. Meanwhile, Europe embraced Mac and Windows, and then Facebook and YouTube without resisting this form of technological colonization. As European competitors fell, the continent did not object. Today, Europe breathes American big tech like air. Google, X, Windows, Facebook, Mac, Instagram, ChatGPT. American big tech treats this as the natural order of things, under the unspoken assumption that Europe is ours. Trump-era policy, however, is creating, for the first time in decades, incentives to challenge that paradigm. The previously absent, faint concern has appeared, prompting reflection on the status quo. Skeptics will say, "I can't imagine a lethargic Europe building a new Google or X." And they are right. American big tech has so thoroughly monopolized the market and habituated people to its ubiquity that an abrupt shift is unrealistic. Yet when we consider several key factors, it becomes clear why Donald Trump may be doing his golden egg-laying goose a disservice. Consumers are generally resistant to change, but there is one exception: values-based change. Some of you are willing to buy domestic products even if they cost 10% more. Others refuse to buy Chinese cars even if they are 30% cheaper, because of Beijing's politics and the world order shaped by the Chinese Communist Party. Until now, such considerations were rarely applied to the United States. Trump and his circle are changing that, and the first signs are already visible. Sales of the American-made Tesla were booming in Europe until the increasingly erratic behavior of its founder, Elon Musk. His hostile remarks toward Europe and Ukraine, combined with gestures that some interpreted as flirting with fascist symbolism, marked a turning point. From that moment on, sales of the American manufacturer began a steady decline. Yes, this coincided with the entry of Chinese electric vehicles into the EU market, but the shift was too abrupt to be explained by this factor alone. The free market immediately sensed an opportunity. Stickers even appeared reading, "I bought this before Elon went crazy." The current trajectory of Trump-era politics poses a similar risk for American big tech and beyond. Collectively, these companies may soon find themselves labeled with a new warning: "I used this before Americans turned against us." European entrepreneurs may well sense this opening, and the stakes are enormous. Billions, if not trillions of euros are on the table. This would not be easy, of course, but on the software side, especially social media platforms, the barriers to replication are relatively low. The harder task is persuading millions of users to migrate to new platforms. Yet, when core values are called into question, a window of opportunity opens. From the outset, however, any such effort would have to overcome Europe's national fragmentation and deliberately position itself as a European brand. One could imagine, for example, a founding capital structure evenly split 20% each among entrepreneurs from Germany, France, Italy, Poland, and Spain. The combined population of these countries alone exceeds that of the United States. Brussels too has been eager to assist in breaking the monopoly of American big tech. For some time now, the EU has been imposing hefty fines on US firms for failing to comply with European standards. In September, Google was hit with a €3 billion fine for favoring its own services in search results. These penalties stem from big tech's non-compliance with EU regulations. The first is the Digital Markets Act, DMA, which mandates, among other things, interoperability between messaging services, limits the bundling of proprietary services, and bans so-called self-preferencing, the very practice for which Google was fined. The second is the Digital Services Act, DSA, which requires platforms to disclose the logic behind their recommendation systems, submit to algorithmic audits, rapidly remove illegal content, and assume responsibility for the spread of disinformation. Taken together, these regulations mean that the European market does not have to remain locked in place. On the contrary, Brussels and individual member states can actively support the organic growth of new platforms. Some EU regulations are undoubtedly problematic, but others indeed serve as a necessary and long overdue mechanism for exerting control over big tech. Now let's place this against another reality: the sky-high Hype-driven stock market valuations of American big tech pushed to limit by the AI boom. If these companies not only fail to deliver AI technologies that can be rapidly monetized, but instead begin to face pressure from an emerging, by necessity, European software ecosystem, their valuations could come under serious strain, and with them, the US economy and its broader power base. The risk becomes even clearer once we consider that roughly 50% of foreign investors in the US stock market are European. This represents a segment worth more than $18 trillion as of the end of 2024, when the total US equity market was valued at roughly $60 trillion. In other words, Europe effectively holds around 15% of the entire US stock market. Europeans are therefore, after Americans themselves, the single most important shareholder of America's technological and financial might. It is partly for this reason that the national security strategy subtly reminds Europe to, quote, open European markets to US goods and services, and ensure fair treatment of US workers and businesses. And let's also recall that while the United States runs a trade deficit with Europe overall, it enjoys a services trade surplus of nearly $100 billion. More than that, thanks to the creative accounting practices of American multinationals, often with their European headquarters located in Ireland, much of Europe's recorded services exports to the US are not genuine value-added services, but simple capital transfers. In the European Central Bank's Mind the Gap report, we read that EU-US services trade data contain large shares of so-called intellectual property charges and other intra-firm services within American multinationals, primarily routed through Ireland. This means that the EU's statistical services deficit vis-à-vis United States is understated, because a significant portion of these flows does not reflect real European services exports, but profit shifting and licensing payments back to the United States. Put plainly, when Google US invoices Google Ireland for the use of its own IP, this appears in the statistics as services exports, even though it is simply a capital transfer. As a result, the current $90 billion services deficit should be seen as a lower bound. The true figure is likely higher. According to ECB estimates, Europe's deficit could approach 160 billion euros by the end of 2025. This is therefore a high-stakes game, with enormous sums on the table. And by overturning many tables at once, Donald Trump may overturn this one as well. Once again, the mere fact of a European awakening does not mean that Europe will suddenly overcome national divisions or rapidly reverse its dependence on American big tech. But the emergence of even a potential motivation to use European or simply non-American products is itself a precedent. French and German firms are best positioned to benefit from such a shift. France's Mistral AI competes directly with ChatGPT and Gemini. OVH Cloud and Nextcloud offer alternatives to Amazon's AWS and Microsoft Azure. Still, to create a genuine perception of a European product, the ownership foundations discussed earlier would be essential, especially for new startups. That is what could provide real scale and a truly European identity, rather than a narrowly national one. And this American-European rift may extend far beyond big tech, affecting virtually every area of cooperation and trade. Europe is a major customer of American defense industry, an asymmetry that does not work in reverse. Yes, Europe remains deeply integrated with US defense technology, but if tensions and rivalry continue to intensify, orders will decline. In practical terms, Europe is capable of internally ordering and producing most of the solutions currently supplied by the United States. All of this creates the risk of a broader pushback. Trump or MAGA successors may attempt to use pressure and coercion to preserve America's preferential position in Europe. But as so often with forceful approaches, the result may be more damage than gain. In what would amount to a self-fulfilling prophecy, transatlantic relations could continue to erode. to the detriment of both sides. And this is where the core argument of this piece, stated at the very outset, comes into focus. The much derided, naive liberal American elites made less noise, but they understood far better the symbiotic relationship between Europe and the United States. A relationship in which if anyone was being taken advantage of, it was Europe. The United States protected Europe not out of, quote, good heart, but out of cold economic calculation. Europe functioned as an extension of American economic power, one that Europeans themselves did not contest. The fact that Washington held all the hard instruments of power translated into agency and decision-making capacity, a reality that suited a fragmented Europe just fine. By cracking the whip against Europe, Trump brings the symbiosis to an end. Europe is already beginning to ask how, across multiple domains, it might start to detach itself from the United States. That fact alone marks a failure of Trump's policy. In the short term, parts of the commentariat marvel at this American display of strength, but real power and agency are often invisible. They do not need to be flaunted, much like truly intelligent people do not walk around advertising their IQ score. Trump's barrage of accusations and his willingness to shatter trust painstakingly built over decades is a one-off phenomenon. A card, once played, loses its power. What is more, Trump is drawing on a reservoir of strength built by the very liberal elites he despises. It was they who constructed the dominance of the US dollar. They who made the United States the ultimate destination for global capital surpluses. And they who built an ecosystem uniquely conducive to the development of technologies that challenge the existing order. This does not mean liberals did everything right. Far from it. The responsibility for enabling China's rise and for helping build a power now actively working to degrade Western agency rests squarely with the liberal elites and the business class of that era. And yet, globalization, so demonized by Trump, remains a core pillar of American power. The omnipresence of American big tech in Europe and around the world is itself proof of that power, one that rests precisely on the rules of globalization. That is why any correction to the globalization-based order should have been gradual and cautious, instead of incremental change, carefully preserving what took decades to build. Washington is effectively throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Trump's America lives in the moment, chasing short-term effects that may carry devastating long-term consequences. This does not herald America's collapse, but it may well signal a relative decline in power driven by the loss of its European force multiplier. The pursuit of something better can easily become the enemy of what is already good. For Europe, the awakening is brutal. Paradoxically, it may yet work in Europeans' favor, though turning this moment of shock into something constructive is far from guaranteed, especially amid the structural chaos currently gripping the continent. Still, one thing should not be overlooked. When vast sums of money are at stake, market forces, motivated by the desire to tear off the American bandage, can overcome formidable barriers. And so the most obvious winners of this confrontation are the adversaries of the Western world. First and foremost, China, then Russia, and finally a whole constellation of secondary powers.